It's unique because it brings together perspectives from across the policy and political spectrum to examine this most important of national security issues. 4 different think tanks participated and had what appears to be a spirited debate of the critical issues. And Produm Adam is timely because it is so sorely needed. As some of the materials for the study say, it helps fill, quote, the current deficit in the national security attention paid to the continued relevance and importance of the U.S. nuclear strategy and force posture, close quote. This committee has been striving to correct this deficit as well. And we welcome Project Adam and its contributing authors in support of that cause. Chairman Thornberry's Nuclear Deterrence Week of hearings and classified briefings this summer was a step along that same path. This subcommittee will continue to work to inform Congress and the public on the requirements for robust and credible nuclear deterrence long into the future. My hope is that Congress and the executive branch, particularly in the next administration, will take a hard look at Project Adam and what it's trying to tell us. Because the bottom line is that the world is not standing still. We are not returning to the Cold War, but we are also not returning to the 1990s when so many people believed international peace and love would reign indefinitely. We need a clear-eyed view of the world's other nuclear states and would-be nuclear states and what we must do to ensure nuclear deterrence holds and nonproliferation prevails. In the short term, we need to focus on building a nuclear strategy, posture, and enterprise that is flexible and responsive. Our witnesses have lots of suggestions on that front, and this committee has advanced legislation toward that goal. In the long term, I believe we need to rethink the logic behind a policy that keeps the United States indefinitely maintaining a nuclear capability we had in the 1990s. As other nations, Russia, China, North Korea, Pakistan, continue to research and deploy new nuclear capabilities over the coming decades, the logical question is, that we must ask is, will the nuclear deterrence capabilities the United States had in the 1990s be credible in 2040? Unless you believe global zero is going to happen any day now, and if you do, then I have a bridge to sell you. We're going to have to re-examine that policy. A choice will be made on this front, not right now, but sometime in the coming years. In the meantime, we can discuss all of this with our panel of witnesses. Thank you all for being here today and contributing to this study. We know it takes a lot of time to prepare for these hearings, and we really appreciate your commitment. The witnesses are Dr. Clark Murdoch, Senior Advisor, Center for Strategic and International Studies, Dr. Keith Payne, Professor and Department Head, Missouri State University, Mr. Elbridge Colby, Robert M. Gates, Senior Fellow, Center for New American Security, Dr. Barry Bleckman, co-founder of the Stimson Center, and Dr. Adam Mount, independent consultant. With that, I will turn to my friend and colleague, the ranking member from Tennessee, for any statement he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this important hearing, and I look forward to the testimony of the witnesses and ask that my statement be inserted for the record.
We'll now ask each of our witnesses to make an opening statement summarizing their prepared testimony and ask to keep that to 4 or 5 minutes. Your written testimony will be without objection entered into the record. Also, without objection, I want to enter into the record the full Project Adam report. Without objection, so ordered. We've provided copies of that report to each of the members and have a few available for others as well. Now, let's hear from the witnesses in this order. First, Dr. Murdoch. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much, Ranking Member Cooper. It's a great opportunity to come here and talk about the Project Adam study. It was designed as a sort of blue sky, look into the future without constraints, policy constraints, or strategy constraints, is to what kind of nuclear needs, what kind of strategy the United States should follow in a 2025 to 2050 time frame. So as I said before, this was unconstrained either by current strategy, by which I mean reduce the role of nuclear weapons as an example, or by current policy, which is no new nuclear capabilities, no new nuclear weapons. So we're out into a 2025 and beyond time frame. The approach we took was a competitive strategies approach. This was funded by Smith Richardson, in part because we took the competitive strategies approach towards it. So I went out and recruited 3 independent think tank teams to participate in this. First was headed by Keith Payne and from the National Institute for Public Policy. Bridge Colby from the Center for a New American Security, and Barry Bleckman from the Stimson Center. And each of them formed a small analytic team that operated throughout and attended the working group members, and then presented their views, defended their views. And then once that process was complete, then I stepped back and wrote what I thought was the right approach to take towards nuclear strategy and its postured needs. And then I defended that in another working group meeting consisting of outside experts and the members of the various independent study think tank teams. So the approach was one of develop a common analytic framework, think through what are the requirements of that security environment, what kind of adversary strategies would be followed, what kind of technological possibilities would be open in the nuclear realm in the 2025 to 2050 timeframe, and then each of us took a separate look at what should be our strategy. My dynamic that I thought was most important were the dynamics that flowed essentially from U.S. conventional superiority. That is, in a world in which nations are seeking to deal and cope with a conventionally superior adversary, namely the United States in this case, would increase their reliance upon nuclear weapons as a way to deter us. And essentially, our conventional superiority, in a sense, lowers the nuclear threshold because it increases the incentives for other nations to resort to nuclear weapons as a way of trying to prevent our intervening in, say, regional adventurism that they might be following. So my belief is that in order to counter other nations' potential interest in using nuclear weapons early in a conflict is that we need to develop a set of robust, discriminate nuclear options in order to be able to respond both proportionally and in kind to any possible use of a nuclear weapon against the United States and its allies. I'm concerned about the fact that we have a force structure largely and a posture largely determined by Cold War needs. The warheads are larger, many of them are less discriminate, many of them carry high collateral damage, and if confronted with a situation where an adversary used a special effects, low collateral weapon, nuclear weapon, against the United States or one of its allies, that we may be self-deterred from responding because we do not have a discriminate or a proportional or an in-kind response that's suitable to that use of a nuclear weapon. So one stress is on what kind of nuclear response options we have. We need to be able to deny the attractiveness of nuclear escalation to our potential adversaries. So we need a new set of capabilities in that area. Another area that I think is particularly important is to look at the requirements for extended deterrence. During the Cold War, the United States coupled its security to the security of our allies and to this, both in the European theater and the Pacific theater. We tend to forget that during the height of the Cold War, the United States had forward deployed 7,000 nuclear weapons in Europe during that time, so that when the Soviets looked at what would happen if they engaged in major conventional aggression, because we perceived, correctly so, that our conventional forces were inferior to the Warsaw Pact forces, they knew that a conflict would go nuclear because there were 7,000 nuclear weapons there. We also had 1,000 nuclear weapons deployed on the Korean Peninsula because we wanted to protect the security of South Korea. And they wanted those nuclear weapons there because they knew that the presence of nuclear weapons on their territory would be credible in terms of potential adversaries. So I think another aspect of our force structure as we move forward, our nuclear force structure as we move forward, is the need to have rapidly deployable and rapidly deployed nuclear weapons that can be either deployed forward during peacetime or can be rapidly moved forward during a moment of crisis in order to provide the nuclear umbrella that we're talking about. So with those two comments, I'll let the other think tanks speak for themselves and pass the floor to Dr. Payne.
Dr. Payne, you're recognized 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Cooper. It's an honor to be here. The assessment by my colleague Tom Schieber and myself is based on the...
You need to turn your microphone on.
Yes, sir. The assessment by my colleague Tom Schieber and myself is based on the proposition that the size and character of the U.S. nuclear force posture needs to be driven first and foremost by a realistic appraisal of international conditions and threats. That's a key presumption because today's international threat environment is extremely dynamic and challenging. The comforting assumption of a relatively benign new world order and a perpetual peace dividend has been overtaken by the reality of multiple highly threatening developments, including new nuclear threats. And as Secretary of Defense Ash Carter recently noted, there's no apparent end in sight for these developments. Given this threatening and indeed surprising security environment, the United States must prepare its forces to deter foes and assure allies through many possible negative shifts in international relations, including the erosion of U.S. conventional superiority, at least in some key areas. We need to plan our deterrence and assurance strategies and capabilities according to these realities, not past unrealistic hopes and expectations. In this context, the proposition that the goal of nuclear disarmament should be the overarching driver of U.S. nuclear policies, I believe, is misguided and even dangerous. Why? Because nobody has offered even the vaguest credible outline of how to make nuclear disarmament a reality in an international system that is characterized by hostility, mistrust, and conflict. And no nuclear power has followed the U.S. lead in this regard. So what are the pertinent implications of these realities? The U.S. force posture must be sufficiently adaptable, flexible, and resilient to deter a variety of threats and foes in many possible contingencies now and in the future. As former STRATCOM Commander General Robert Kaler has observed rightly, and I quote, "Surprise is a problem in a constantly changing world. In my view, the future requires adaptive and flexible U.S. capabilities to respond to unanticipated threats." Precisely right. The U.S. must work to sustain or expand these force posture qualities: adaptability, flexibility, and resilience. That's the primary standard of adequacy we need to meet now and for the future. There are several steps that could be taken to increase the adaptability of U.S. forces, particularly including modernizing the U.S. nuclear triad and forward-based forces. Further deep reductions in U.S. nuclear forces, however, would likely instead undercut these very qualities that may be critical to being able to deter war and assure nervous allies. In addition, I should add that if you care about nonproliferation, you must care about maintaining the capability and the credibility of the U.S. nuclear extended deterrent. The U.S. nuclear umbrella is the single most important nonproliferation tool that we have. In conclusion, U.S. forces must be able to adapt to an increasingly dangerous and unpredictable threat environment, not geared to past set expectations of a benign new world order, enduring U.S. conventional force superiority, a never-ending peace dividend, or an overarching goal of nuclear disarmament. The now apparent dangers of the post-Cold War threat environment have come to many as a big surprise. For 2 decades, Western defense thinking in general has been geared to a new world order in which nuclear weapons would play an ever smaller role on the path to nuclear zero. General Breedlove, NATO's supreme allied commander, recently acknowledged that for 2 decades, the U.S. has treated Russia as a potential ally. That belief has been the backdrop for decades of deep U.S. nuclear reductions and a general lack of attention to U.S. nuclear forces. Now, however, as General Breedlove said further, we must readjust. The realities of contemporary threats now argue strongly in favor of modernizing U.S. nuclear forces and emphasizing their adaptability, not further reductions and greater rigidity. That's the primary takeaway from the assessment that my colleague Tom Schieber and I provided. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Payne. Mr. Colby, you recognize 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Cooper, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you very much for inviting me to testify on the future of America's nuclear deterrent. It is an honor to speak to you today on this matter of the greatest importance to our nation's security. We are entering a period of significant and possibly dramatic change in both the geopolitical and the military technological spheres. In brief, the United States is likely to confront more significant challenges to its interests from countries like China in Asia and Russia in and around Europe. At the same time, U.S. conventional military advantages over its plausible opponents will likely narrow. This will have major implications for U.S. defense strategy writ large, but also for our nuclear deterrent. Accordingly, the United States needs to adapt its nuclear policy and posture. What in particular should change? If the United States continues to want to extend deterrence effectively, as I believe it should, U.S. nuclear weapons need to do more than threaten unhindered devastation. Thus, while the ultimate source of U.S. deterrence should of course remain the threat of overwhelming destruction, the United States should also prepare for and make clear that it would, as appropriate, use its nuclear forces in more limited fashion for more focused effect. In particular, the United States should adapt its nuclear forces to be able to fight a limited nuclear war more effectively than its plausible adversaries. Such superiority would give the United States important and possibly crucial leverage to defend its interests in both peace and war. The U.S. nuclear force of today is not, however, optimally designed for this demanding set of criteria. To optimize its nuclear force, the United States should do the following: invest appropriately in an improved nuclear command and control system such that U.S. nuclear forces can perform their missions reliably under any plausible conditions and do so in sufficiently controlled and deliberate ways. Maintain the nuclear triad to ensure a resilient, redundant, and highly capable nuclear deterrent. In addition to fully funding the SSBN replacement and replacing the Minuteman III, the United States should maintain and modernize its fleet of nuclear-armed bombers. This modernization effort is particularly important in light of the unique attack capabilities found in the bomber force, but also in the growing challenges to stealth and its ability to penetrate. This effort should include procuring the LRS-B in sufficient numbers, maintaining the B-52H and B-2A, buying sufficient dual-capable F-35s for regional deterrence and assurance, and acquiring the long-range standoff option missile. The United States should also move in the direction of providing most or all of its nuclear forces with variable yield warheads or weapons that can provide a variety of types of effects, such as electromagnetic pulse, different height of bursts, use at sea, and so forth, so that the United States can more effectively tailor strikes from the full range of its available platforms. The United States should in particular focus on making the ballistic missile force more capable of discriminate strikes. The United States should accordingly render at least some portion of the Trident II D5 SLBM arsenal capable of lower yield strikes, for instance by using primary-only warheads. The United States should also ensure that the LRSO is capable of discriminate employment by arming it with a variable yield warhead. Given the proliferation of hardened and deeply buried targets, or HDBTs, Earth penetration should be a special focus of long-term research and development and ultimately procurement. This is vital, I emphasize, both for deterrence and for stability. The size and composition of the nuclear force should be determined based on strategic considerations. Arms control should be pursued where and so it contributes to stability, but not for the sake of reductions. In closing, the world is changing in ways that dictate that U.S. nuclear policy and posture should also change. The United States should grasp the opportunity to make such changes while unfavorable trends are still nascent and susceptible to counteraction. I believe a modernization program along these lines would add to a favorable stability and ultimately to the kind of peace we and our allies justifiably seek. I look forward to any questions you might have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Colby. Mr. Bleckman, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr.
Dr. Bleckman, I apologize.
Oh, that's all right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Cooper, and members of the subcommittee. This is a good opportunity. I have a rather different view than my colleagues in this project, and I'll briefly summarize it now. In my view, U.S. security benefits by seeking to minimize the importance and roles of nuclear weapons in the perceptions and actions of foreign leaders. For the United States, nuclear weapons serve only to deter nuclear attacks on ourselves and on our allies. Maintaining U.S. conventional superiority is the key to U.S. security. And our nuclear weapon programs harm this by raising the prospect of false alternatives, such as being able to fight controlled nuclear wars, and by their direct effects on budgets and on the training of U.S. military personnel. So in summary, I believe the U.S. should work diplomatically to constrain nukes as circumstances permit, adopt policies and doctrines, and work politically to strengthen the nuclear taboo, and adjust force posture and modernization programs to reduce expenditures. Our security depends mainly on political leadership, on diplomacy, and on our economic instruments of power, private and public, and it also depends on our conventional superiority, which is due to the scale and longevity of our investments in advanced technologies and systems, on the size of our forces, and on the quality and training of our people. We can't do everything with military force, but we can defeat any conventional threat we face currently. China and Russia are making advances, but I believe the U.S. should be able to maintain superiority if our citizens remain willing to allocate sufficient resources. And I'd be happy to debate this point during the questions. Maintaining our technological and quantitative conventional edge should be our highest priority, and this will be hampered increasingly by the bow wave of nuclear spending that we're facing in the next decade. In my view, the primary goal of our nuclear policy should be the elimination of nuclear weapons from all nations. I recognize this is not going to be achieved until many, many political conflicts are resolved and may never be achieved, but it's certainly a goal that I think should be a vision that should be underneath our policies. Until elimination becomes feasible, if it ever does, the U.S. should, one, stress a firm commitment to nuclear retaliation for any nuclear attack, be clear that any nuclear attack on the U.S. or our ally will result in retaliation, no matter how small the yield of the attack, no matter what the target might be, or whatever the range of the launcher which was used to fire the weapon. But we should also make clear that this deterrent role is the only purpose of U.S. weapons. Deterrence, in my mind, depends not on nuclear capabilities, but on boots on the ground. If we're concerned about the possibility of Russian incursion in the Baltic states, we should, and I believe we should, greatly improve NATO's presence on the ground in those countries so that the Russians never come to the misperception that they can perform a fait accompli before NATO can respond to that. And there are ideas around to put the equipment, pre-deploy equipment for U.S. armored brigades in those countries, and I strongly support those ideas as well as related things. So the implications of this policy for U.S. nuclear forces are, one, as the current generation ages out, I believe we can reduce the number of our forces unilaterally. I think we should maintain a triad, but that could be reduced to perhaps 8 to 10 submarines, to 2 Minuteman wings, with only modest investments can be maintained viable until the 2040s. I believe we should put a high emphasis, high priority on the new bomber, primarily for its conventional role, but also for a nuclear role. I think we should phase out tactical nuclear weapons as their service lives expire, because there's nothing those weapons can accomplish that could not be accomplished by a long-range strategic bomber armed with a variable yield weapon. And finally, I think we should divert the resources we save by making those reductions to our conventional capabilities, particularly command and control survivability, which I agree with Bridge on that, on continued R&D on defenses, missile defenses, and deploying such defenses as the technologies mature, and on cyber and EW capabilities, and on advanced conventional technologies. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Bleckman. Dr. Mount, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairman Rogers, Congressman Cooper, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to discuss this with you today. The world we are entering is indeed a period of strategic competition. However, this does not mean we're in a new Cold War. Today's challenge is one of maintaining stability in regional contexts and defending the core interests of U.S. allies against limited but persistent encroachment. Both China and Russia are engaged in extensive programs to modernize their nuclear arsenals, but with a few important exceptions, both countries are replacing legacy systems that have reached the end of their service lives. Neither country plans to operate a submarine force capable of maintaining boats continually on station near our shores, and neither plans to construct a low observable bomber platform. For the foreseeable future, U.S. nuclear forces will remain markedly more capable. Recent calls to build new nuclear weapons and to deploy them closer to potential zones of conflict represent a dramatic departure from long-standing bipartisan consensus nuclear policy. Since the 1980s, presidents of both parties have worked to reduce the salience of nuclear weapons in our military planning, to gradually reduce our nuclear stockpile, and to refrain from procuring new capabilities. New nuclear weapons are unlikely to be effective instruments for deterrence or defense in this new era of hybrid conflict. Both Russia and China are likely to continue to pursue their objectives with operations that remain well below the threshold of war. Nuclear weapons, no matter what kind and no matter where they are stationed, cannot deter this kind of threat. They cannot help to roll back Russian occupation of Crimea or put a halt to Chinese land reclamation in the South China Sea. At the same time, it is far from certain that low-yield and special effects nuclear weapons are necessary for deterrence or escalation control. The United States cannot be certain that these weapons will deter better than the strategic arsenal, or that they will restrain an adversary from conducting further nuclear strikes. The enormous strategic and diplomatic costs of employing a tactical weapon make it unlikely that they would be utilized, which in turn decreases their utility as instruments of deterrence. China and Russia are already threatened by American superiority. New nuclear programs would likely cause them to accelerate their modernization efforts, contributing to what former Secretary of Defense Bill Perry recently warned is a new round in the nuclear arms race. For these reasons, imbalances should be addressed through verifiable arms control agreements. For this reason, the United States should press Russia to engage in negotiations not only to limit existing nuclear systems, but also the procurement programs that each country finds most threatening. Initiating new nuclear procurement programs in the United States would also have serious effects on the national defense budget. If history is any precedent, Congress is unlikely to obligate funds for 100 new bombers and 12 new Ohio replacement submarines, on top of numerous other outlays. Unexpected cuts to core systems of the triad will require changes in strategy and operations. At the same time, nuclear modernization plans also place significant pressure on other military priorities, especially in Navy shipbuilding and the F-35 program. Congress and the White House should seek prudent cuts to the modernization plans in advance so that the services can plan for the future. Specifically, Congress should require the Department of Defense to generate studies that explain the need for a new cruise missile, examine the effect of moving to a force of 8 to 10 ballistic missile submarines, and to provide regular cost estimates of new spending on nuclear systems, especially the new long-range strike bomber. Lastly, the costs of seeking new nuclear capabilities are not only monetary. Reneging on the U.S. commitment not to build new nuclear capabilities could stress a beleaguered nuclear nonproliferation treaty regime to the breaking point, and thereby deprive the United States of important tools to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons. At the same time, new procurement efforts would encourage other countries not to seek these At the same time, new procurement efforts would encourage the other countries to seek these capabilities. It is far safer to maintain that nuclear weapons are not an effective means of controlling escalation. In conclusion, current and projected strategic conditions do not warrant major changes to long-standing nuclear force structure. It is critical to national security and the nation's standing in the world that the United States maintain its commitment not to seek new nuclear capabilities and to continue gradual, negotiated reductions of its nuclear arsenal. Thank you.
I thank you, Dr. Mountain. I thank all the witnesses, and I'd like to recognize myself now for the first round of questions. As you heard me say in my opening statement, I'm worried about the current U.S. nuclear strategy and posture is not quite suited, the current U.S. nuclear strategy and posture is not suited to the world we're finding ourselves in during the 21st century. It seems to be based on what you might call the hopeful aspirations of the mid to late 20th century. Dr. Murdoch, you served in the Clinton administration's Department of Defense during those heady days. Your bio is pegged as a long-range planner, pegged you as a long-range planner. So let me ask you, do you think the current nuclear strategy and posture keeps us secure for the long run? And if not, what do you suggest we change, and what action should this committee take to get us back on the right track?
Thank you for the question. I have described myself as a long-range planner. It's one of the reasons why we put the horizon for Project Atom out to 2025 to 2050, because we have to think about systems that will take 10 to 15 years to develop, systems that will have lifetimes of 35 to 50 years. So you have to think in terms of a longer range perspective. As I look into the deeper future, the longer-range future, I think that the risks of proliferation are higher. We're already dealing with potential near-term risks of nuclear proliferation in the Middle East, but there are similar pressures in other regions of the world. And in a more highly proliferated world, I think we have to develop the kind of capabilities that can deter the kinds of nuclear employments that our adversaries may make against us. It means, in my mind, that we have to develop discriminate, low yield, variable yield, special effects weapons so that we can respond in kind and respond proportionally to any potential use of a nuclear weapon against the United States or its allies. I think that this emphasis upon being able to respond proportionally and in kind is critical for deterrence during this time. As I said before in my statement, I worry about the prospect that if we are confronted with a limited nuclear use against us, that because of the character of our weapons, that we may be self-deterred from responding in kind because we would have to go too high up the escalatory ladder, use too large a yield a bomb or missile or warhead. And it's important that we develop the robust set of options so that a president can respond proportionally and in kind to any use of a nuclear weapon against us. This is not saying that we have to go out and seek superiority. Right now, we are in a position of inferiority when it comes to non-strategic nuclear forces, otherwise known as tactical nuclear weapons. The Russians have somewhere between 2,000 and 4,000. I'm sometimes not sure they even know how many they have. We have forward deployed approximately a couple of hundred and very small inventories back here in the United States. So my feeling is that we do not have to address this quantitative superiority that the Russians have maintained in this class of systems, but I do believe we have to develop a range of options so that we can respond discriminately to any potential use of those tactical nuclear weapons by the Russians.
Thank you. Dr. Payne, you were a primary author of George W. Bush's administration in his nuclear posture review. How has Russia as an actor on the world stage, in particular, in nuclear affairs, changed since then?
Well, we first saw evidence of a change in Russian behavior and Russian doctrine in 2008, where, according to senior Russian officials, Russia was ready to call a nuclear alert with their operations against Georgia in 2008. We've more recently seen Russia back up its operations against Crimea and the occupation of Crimea with what President Putin himself said was a nuclear escalation threat. So what we've learned since those days of writing the 2001 nuclear posture review is that Russia has moved in a direction in some ways much harsher, particularly in terms of its potential use of nuclear weapons than we anticipated at the time. We've seen the evolution of Russian doctrine, we've seen the evolution of Russian strategy and the evolution of Russian forces to where, at this point, I think you can honestly and quite fairly say that Russia has a nuclear first-use policy, a limited nuclear first-use policy, that's meant to backstop its territorial grabs in Central Europe and Southern Europe. And given that, it seems to me that we need to move in the direction that Clark just outlined, if only to be able to deter. And I'm not interested in being able to respond per se to a nuclear war, but we want to be able to deter the nuclear war in the first place. So we want to be able to deter the Russian Federation from believing it can get anything useful out of a first nuclear use, out of a first nuclear use threat. And in my opinion, that requires exactly the type of capabilities that Dr. Murdoch was just describing.
Great. And Mr. Colby, your testimony suggests that the U.S. should make its nuclear forces more flexible and create the ability to tailor nuclear strikes in a narrower fashion than available today. You mentioned low-yield warheads, tailored effects like EMP, earth penetration, etc. Compared to what our current strategic arsenals provide, How would these types of new capabilities provide increased deterrence toward adversaries, and why do we need them?
Well, thanks, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to build on the previous comments, which I generally agreed with. I think the basic problem here is that we are extending deterrence far and wide as part of our nation's grand strategy. That includes countries like the Baltic states, like the Philippines, to some extent maybe Taiwan, countries where we're very close to our potential adversaries, and adversaries that have not only increasingly powerful conventional militaries, but also survivable nuclear forces. So whatever they do to us, to some extent, they can hit us back very seriously. The problem is, as Clark and Keith described, is an adversary may think that he can escalate, especially if he creates favorable conditions on the ground, for instance, through the use of little green men in the Baltics, and then use his conventional forces to create a favorable situation, such as a fait accompli, and then threaten to escalate to de-escalate of some kind. Basically say, I dare you to come at me and go big, even just conventionally, but you're going to have to go big in such a way that it's going to look really escalatory and really dangerous. And if we do that, he may decide, just to take one scenario, he may decide to use nuclear weapons in a very tailored, very limited way, specifically designed not only to hurt us militarily, but also to scare not only us, but all our allies in this endeavor. And the problem is that if we only have big response, as Clark put it, we are very potentially going to be self-deterred, but also even if we executed it, the Russians, for instance, would have a way of responding in a very dramatic and catastrophic fashion. So far better for us and far better for deterrence if we have roughly proportionate, same order of magnitude ways of saying, don't think it's going to make sense for you to escalate to the nuclear level, even in this sort of clever escalate to de-escalate way. We have a way of defeating that strategy. I mean, to put it kind of bluntly, an adversary is less likely to raise on you if he knows you have good cards. And I think that these kinds of capabilities are basically good cards.
Great, thank you. Chair now recognizes the ranking member for any questions he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, Dr. Murdoch, I appreciate your leading a very provocative report. It's very helpful to get this discussion started. I was wondering, first off, when you picked 3 other think tanks, what points of view are left out? What think tanks or viewpoints could have or should have been included?
That's an interesting question, sir. What I was trying to do is to get what I refer to as think tanks that were representative across sort of the broad middle of the spectrum of opinion. There are many people in this town who are more conservative than Keith Payne. There are many people in this town who are more liberal than Barry Bleckman. But I do know that, first of all, the two of them can be in the same room and talk to each other. That's not true of people that are further divided on the spectrum of opinion. And since I'm holding a lot of working group meetings, I want to make sure that people can come in and talk to each other. So what I was looking to do was to bound the range of opinion to what I would say was the reasonable left and the reasonable right. Although people may disagree in that kind of characterization, they may even themselves disagree on that characterization, and then find somebody who is a bit more centrist. I probably should have done a little bit more research on this, because Bridge, who I did want to include because he's a member of the next generation of thinkers that are coming up, and I do a lot of work on that level as well, that Keith, that Bridge was probably a bit closer to where Keith was than he was to where Barry was. That is true. And it turned out that both of them were closer to, that I was closer where both of them were than I was to Barry. But there are clearly, we bounded the middle of the spectrum of opinion with Keith Payne, that I did with Keith Payne and Barry Bleckman. It did not go further out onto the margins.
In the report, it seems that everybody agrees on keeping the triad. Everybody agrees on improving command and control. And most of you want basically every weapon in the arsenal that we don't have, varying the yield and other criteria. So on the yield, on page 20 of your report, you talk about how the massive ordnance penetrator, the MOPS at 30,000 pounds, is about 20 times smaller than our smallest nuke. So presumably you want to fill that gap with something that would be proportionate and discriminate. Are there key points within that? Do we need a midway weapon? Do we need, what exactly are you looking at, sub-kiloton?
I think it depends entirely, from my perspective, it depends a great deal on what we know about what the Russians are developing. We know that the Russians are doing experimentation in the very lower end of the nuclear yield. I personally believe that the deterrent impact of a nuclear weapon is partially resides in its ability, in terms of how much damage it can inflict, the blast heat and fragmentations associated with any weapon, but it's also a nuclear weapon. It has a radioactive signal. It indicates a willingness to break a threshold. Barry referred to the nuclear taboo that's essentially been in existence since Hiroshima and Nagasaki, so that there are those who believe that we can have a complete continuum from conventional to nuclear. I'm happy to have a break between conventional weapons and nuclear weapons. Perhaps the Russians have developed a system that is somewhat larger than our largest conventional bomb and somewhat smaller than our smallest nuclear weapon. If that is the case, and they feel that by using it under certain circumstances that they can go nuclear without threatening our spectrum of responses, that's something I want to be able to respond to in kind. So my belief is you design, it is our adversaries, because of our conventional superiority, who are increasing their reliance upon nuclear weapons, who have been experimenting and developing nuclear capabilities that are more varied than ours. And I think that is the principal driver of what kind of capabilities we need to have.
Mm-hmm. How do you define what is a new nuclear weapon as opposed to a refurb or?
Well, it's a little bit like angels dancing on the head of a pin when you're talking about a life extension program where you replace many, many elements of the conventional elements that are part of the warhead. At what point do you have a new weapon? Well, if it's still the physics package, the nuclear portion of it is still within the range of what existed there, people say, well, it's not a new weapon. I mean, my belief is that when we're going into an environment where there's an increased risk of our potential adversaries breaking the nuclear threshold, I want a new weapon. I could say, well, we can adapt this particular weapon we have so it comes pretty close to it. I want to be able to convince our adversary, we've already thought about what you want to do. We're developing new weapons to counter that. We are going to ensure that those weapons work through our stockpile stewardship system, and we're going to train with them and exercise with them so that it will be credible, that our adversaries believe that if they use a nuclear weapon, we will use one in response. You don't do that by just saying it. I believe you have to do it by fielding the appropriate weapons, by practicing with them, by training with them, so that our adversaries will understand if you go nuclear, we are prepared to deal with that too.
You use the analogy of angels dancing on the head of a pin. I assume you are not discounting the distinction between what's new and what is a refurbishment of an older weapon. Could we, using our existing stockpile, create enough sub-kiloton weapons or other special effects to achieve this, or are we forced to create new weapons?
I am not familiar enough with the classified details of how variable our variable yields are. There are a number of ideas that are out there. For example, when you talk about a primary-only weapon, where they use just the fissionable aspect of it and not the thermonuclear one. They've suggested that that's a way of varying the yield of some of the largest warheads that we have on ballistic missile defenses during that time. My belief is that when you're talking about deterring adversaries who are thinking about using nuclear weapons to deter you, you want to think about, well, what are the kind of capabilities I need to deter that? And a new weapon indicates to the adversary that we're serious about this, that we're designing a weapon to counter his potential use of a nuclear weapon against us. I personally don't have an allergy against new nuclear weapons. So there is a reason why, as I look to the future, the kind of capabilities we need, I think the prescription of no new weapons and no new nuclear capabilities is a self-defeating one. And so from a perspective of developing a deterrent that works, I don't think we should be bound by those kind of rules.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I look forward to the next round of questioning.
Thank the ranking member. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Lambert, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for having this hearing, and thank you all for being here and for your hard work. I'd like to ask something to Dr. Clark, Murdoch, Dr. Keith Payne, and Mr. Elbridge Colby in particular. There was some talk that there was consideration of further unilateral cuts beyond what New START called for. And I'm not sure that that has died down or not. I hope it has, but should that kind of talk be resurrected, would any of the three of you advocate for further unilateral cuts on the part of the U.S. of our nuclear stockpile?
I would not, sir.
I would not, sir.
No.
Okay. Given the open sources that have reported that there could be cheating by the Russians on the INF treaty, does that call into question on the parts of you three gentlemen, again, our adherence to the New START treaty? And my thought is that we are handicapping ourselves in some ways through New START. If it's reciprocated, that's one thing, but if they are cheating in other areas, will it even be reciprocated? And should we continue handicapping ourselves? That's my question, and I'd like to get your perspective.
My belief is that each of the agreements that we've reached with the Russians are separate agreements, and that we should abide by an agreement that we've reached with them on New START unless there's clear evidence that they are not abiding by that same agreement on New START. My belief is that I think there's pretty clear evidence that they've cheated on the INF treaty, and I think that we have to think through how to respond to that in a way that's in the field of INF and responds directly and proportionally in some way to the violation of that treaty. It's not something that we should ignore, or nor that we should deny that it existed. I think we have to respond to it, but I would not respond to it by violating New START, because in part that takes the onus off the Russians for violating arms control agreements that they've agreed to.
Yes, sir, I don't recommend withdrawing from the New START treaty. I agree with Clark that we ought to look at these things individually. I do think that there are some options that we can take with regard to Russian violations of the INF treaty, as you described, but withdrawing from the New START treaty, I don't believe is one of them we should exercise. But I will add that I think that it's possible that the Russians are not going to adhere to the New START treaty. There have been a number of statements coming out of senior Russian officials setting since the basis for not abiding by the New START treaty limitations in 2018. This is what they did with the INF treaty in earlier parts of 2007, for example, where recently former Secretary of Defense mentioned that the Russians had talked to him and indicated they were interested in withdrawing from the INF treaty. You do see Russian officials now sort of setting the same base for the New START treaty. Doesn't mean they're going to withdraw from it. Doesn't mean that they're not going to abide by it. But I would at least keep in the back of my mind that they are now talking along those lines, and watch very carefully to see what they do.
I pretty much agree with Dr. Payne, sir. I would say I think Russian violations of INF are extremely serious and require really concerted action. I'm actually somewhat mystified why the administration is not more alarmed by this, since I see arms control as a strategic tool, as a way that we can or may advance our interests in the world. And so if a country violates it, we can go back to not having it. But if you're committed to a world without nuclear weapons, you need to make sure that treaties are sacrosanct, and yet there doesn't seem to be a lot of concern, which mystifies me. But it is very serious because of the military dimension, and there are when I spoke about these escalatory options, INF may give them potential there. So we really need to be putting pressure on them. I think at the very least we should be looking at R&D that's legal under the treaty to see what our options are. Other kind of countervailing options should be looked at and talked about, at least in principle, openly. And ultimately, we should make sure that the Russians bear the cost and the diplomatic and political costs of their violations and misbehavior. At this time, I think we do benefit from New START in terms of predictability and some data exchange, that kind of thing. It's not any kind of dramatic thing, and also it allows us to do the fundamental things that we need to do in terms of the modernization of our forces. But if, as Dr. Payne mentions, we do detect Russian noncompliance or circumvention, we should look at that very, very carefully. And the Russians should understand if they violate or circumvent treaties that we will be prepared to call them on that and respond.
All right, thank you all.
Thank the gentleman. Chair, I recognize gentleman Mr. Aguilar for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being here, gentlemen. This one's for the group, and as it was mentioned in the Wolfstall and Lewis, the $1 trillion triad report, Dr. Mount, you mentioned that in your testimony a few times, and the cost estimate of $1 trillion to upgrade our nuclear triad over the next 30 years. Based on this mind-boggling figure, how can we, regardless of the strategic argument, realistically talk about developing and deploying lower yield weapons when clearly now and in the future some of these serious investments, we need to make some serious investments in our conventional capabilities with finite dollars available to us. It's imperative that they be invested wisely. And I give you some credit because in your testimony you do talk about some of the financial implications as well. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, thank you for that, Congressman. I'd be glad to. It's important to realize that there's a bound in these estimates, anywhere between 800 billion and 1.1 trillion, depending on what you include and how you include potential figures for cost growth. That having been said, I think it's important to realize that these funds are not likely to be appropriated in their entirety, and it's important to sort of plan ahead and allow the services to plan ahead and make sure they know what's coming so that they're not caught unawares with abrupt changes to nuclear force structure that are mandated by Congress. I think it's important for the White House and the services to sort of together cultivate a plan to bring these modernization plans under control, and I outlined a couple of ways to do that. It's important to realize that I think there are some areas where the modernization plans can be pared back without deleteriously impacting our ability to deter our adversaries or to respond to a wide range of conflicts. So these include the new cruise missile I think we should take a serious look at, and also the large number of submarines that we're planning to build. Now, that's not to say that we ought to throw the plans out the window. We will buy a new bomber, and we should. We will buy new submarines, and we should. And it's important to prioritize and protect appropriations for those systems that are critical to national deterrence and deterrence operations, while looking for areas that bring these modernization plans sort of back into the fold of reality.
Anyone else?
I just note that I think we're already seeing the effects of the greater burden of nuclear modernization on the budget. I noticed that in the $5 billion reduction that was necessitated by the budget agreement, there were substantial cuts in Army readiness, which is not a choice that I would make. I think far more important than the full extent of the nuclear modernization program is to ensure that our ground forces and other conventional forces are as ready and as capable as they might be.
I think the chairman would also convey that that reduction to readiness was a reduction of the increase to readiness, which a lot of other members advocated for as well. One additional point, instead of, are any of you concerned about, with the lower yield weapon that we're discussing, that this investment would give other countries more of a reason to invest in their own nuclear arsenals and maintaining this constant drumbeat of the arms race? I mean, and some of you alluded to that in your testimony, but would anyone like to expand on their concerns with respect to that point? Mr. Colby and then Dr. Murdoch.
Sure. Thank you, Congressman, for your question. I think it's an important one. I mean, in my statement, I emphasized the need for change, but I also think that it's very important for the United States to appear and to act in a way that's responsible and kind of a good steward of its nuclear weapons. But I think, Congressman, the main challenge to U.S. interests and to stability, really, is not so much from a kind of mimicking of what we do, but of a potential opening of vulnerability. And I think the world is changing. Our potential adversaries, I should say, have been increasing their military budgets abundantly, both in the conventional and nuclear realm. And I think if we don't respond, it's actually vulnerability creates an instability of its own, and that's what concerns me. There are other universes. There's the world of the 1990s in which the problem was different. So I would not always say that this is the right course of action. Turn to Dr. Payne.
If I might, go back to the cost question, just because I'd like to add a point to that, and that is the best study I've seen on cost has been done by CSBA, came out a few months ago. What that study said is that the budget for nuclear modernization and recapitalization will range from 3 to 4.9% of DoD's budget, reaching a top of 4.9% in 2029. It then concluded that unless we talk about eliminating an entire leg of the triad, trying to find money in that budget is, and I quote, the hunt for small potatoes. And every study that's represented in this assessment that Dr. Murdoch led calls for maintaining the triad, not eliminating the triad. So I would suggest that given the priority of nuclear deterrence, and Secretary of Defense Ash Carter has said nuclear deterrence is DoD's first priority, that those types of cost structures obviously have to be managed well, but given that it's DoD's first priority to maintain a credible nuclear deterrent, it seems to me that the recapitalization is not going to be too expensive. It's a matter of will and it's a matter of priorities. On the action-reaction question, sir, that you asked, the general notion, as you put it forward and is put forward frequently, is if the United States goes forward with the type of capabilities that Bridge talked about or Clark talked about, that this might encourage, say, the Russian Federation to respond and go in that direction as well. Let me suggest—
Gentleman's time's expired. I'm going to have to, sorry, but I would ask you this. It's a very provocative question. Any of the witnesses that would be willing to provide us a response in writing, I would appreciate that. For the record, that would be very helpful. Let me try to keep us on schedule and go to Mr. Fleming of Louisiana.
Apologies, Mr. Chairman.
I'm sorry? No, you asked a good question. That's why I appreciate it. I would like everybody to respond to it. Mr. Fleming is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'm glad to hear. It's very interesting to hear that really a debate that's going on right in front of our eyes, a panel on where we go with our nuclear deterrence. And I do appreciate the fact that it seems there's a consensus that we maintain our nuclear triad, and I certainly agree with that. We want to make our potential adversaries the most complex problem possible. That's how deterrence works. Dr. Payne, I have a question for you. How do long-range bombers factor into your call for greater adaptability and flexibility in our future nuclear posture? And could you explain why we need the new long-range strike bomber that will eventually replace portions of our current bomber force?
Yeah, I'm very much in favor of both the new bomber and also the new cruise missile, specifically because they contribute to the adaptability that I think is so important for deterrence. I mean, to go back and set the stage, if we don't have a deterrent that can adapt to changing circumstances, we may have a deterrent that fails. And our most important priority is having a deterrent that does not fail to the extent that we can produce a deterrent that won't fail. And having a bomber and the LRSO, the new cruise missile that would be with that bomber, allows the United States to be able to adapt to many different circumstances. It allows different options for the president to respond or to threaten to respond. It's just a key part of having an adaptable force structure.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Colby and Dr. Murdoch, can you give us a succinct and compelling case for why we need the long-range strike standoff weapon, the long-range bomber, which will replace our current air-launched cruise missile? And do you believe this is an important capability, and why or why not?
I do, sir, and thank you for the question. I think at least two major factors. One is that stealth, which is the basis for the B-2, and low observability, which will be the basis for the long-range penetrating bomber, are both, it's a critical capability, but we don't know the future of it. We know our adversaries are making a lot of progress in detection and targeting of these weapons. And even if we can still partially operate, there may be constraints on what we can do. So we want to have a backup option. We want to be able to penetrate, especially given the plenitude, the panoply of targets we may be going after. The second and related point is a cost imposition point. We want our adversary to have to prepare for a weapon with a totally different trajectory, and this is as true in the conventional realm as it is in the nuclear realm. So I think given the amounts we're talking about with the long-range standoff option, it makes abundant sense. And I also think this is more of a rebuttal to some of the arguments that are out there, that this is not a destabilizing weapon. In fact, the United States' traditional position was that cruise missiles were generally stabilizing. And we have been using conventional cruise missiles without incident, without somebody thinking it was the prelude to a nuclear attack for 40 years. Some, obviously if we use them in certain ways that we probably wouldn't do, we'd want to be really careful about, it would raise those kinds of questions. But I think that it's a bit of a canard.
Yeah, and Mr. Colby, do you have I can't see your name.
I think you asked the question of me. Mr. Colby spoke first. I fully
Oh, I'm
agree.
sorry.
That's
Dr.
all right.
Murdoch, yeah.
That's all right. I fully agree
Can't
with
see
this.
your name. I can't see your nameplate, so I'm not sure who is who up there. There, thank you.
I fully agree and support the statements that Mr. Colby made at that time. I think the particular aspect is that it's a hedge against the failure of stealth. The B-52 has been our most reliable bomber platform for decades. It requires and depends upon standoff weapons to survive, both for conventionally and in nuclear mode. And to me, to give up the flexibility, as Keith Payne would refer to, of having a standoff missile, a standoff penetrating missile. It's easier to penetrate with a missile than it is with an aircraft during that time. Plus, they're a lot cheaper when you're talking about the number of missiles you need versus the number of platforms you might need to penetrate with, that it is affordable. And as Keith also pointed out, the CSBA study makes it clear, 35-year projection of 1.1 trillion sounds like a lot. Well, military capability is expensive. It costs, $1 billion a year just simply to operate a carrier. That's not even talking about buying it, just to operate a carrier. So these capabilities are very expensive. But the issue, as the CSBA report points out, is what is the priority of this? Can we afford to spend 5% of the U.S. defense budget on anything? Of course we can. The question is that 5% more important than other competing priorities? And I would argue when you're talking about a foundational capability like our deterrent, which is the bedrock of national power, we can afford that.
Well, and I would agree. I mean, it's not only saving money through dividends, but it's saving lives through wars not fought. So I think, and I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Chair, and I recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Garamendi, for 5 minutes.
Chairman Rogers, thank you so very, very much. This is an extraordinarily important policy issue. It's a policy that we'll be dealing with, I think, in the next, this year and on into probably the next 5 years. But we will set in place, one way or another, an extraordinarily important process. We've heard from what I would call the advocates of a greater nuclear. I'd like to have Mr. Belchman take about 3.5 of my 5 minutes and come back with your arguments as to what you've heard here, Mr. Belchman, Dr. Belchman. If you can pull that microphone down in front of you. There you go.
Yeah, thank you. Well, my arguments are several-fold. One, the idea that we can fight controlled nuclear wars is based on theology. It's never happened. No one knows what would happen once a nuclear weapon is used. And the notion that we can only match a nuclear weapon with a like kind of nuclear weapon is, to me, it's not based on any empirical fact. It's ideas. And they have their ideas, and I have a different idea. For example, if there were, say, a conventional conflict in Estonia, that NATO had built up its conventional forces there, the Russians intervened nonetheless. There was a big conventional war. The Russians, facing conventional defeat, used a nuclear weapon. The U.S. could respond with a nuclear weapon delivered by a B-1 bomber, which perhaps previously had been deployed to Europe with a variable yield. And there's no reason to think, in my mind, that such a response would not be just as compelling as being able to respond with a tactical weapon delivered by a fighter jet. In fact, I'd have doubts as to whether the current tactical fighters would be able to penetrate the Russian air defenses to deliver that weapon, and also that the European crews would be authorized by their governments to deliver those weapons. So I think we're much better off depending on our strategic forces. So that was a view shared by the former Air Force Chief of Staff, General Schwartz, for example.
I thank you for that. I must say this is extraordinarily disturbing to me personally. I don't know if any of us have actually seen a nuclear explosion. I suppose we've seen films of it. It seems to me that if we really want to deter a tactical nuclear option that Russia might deploy, we simply say this: you use it and your history. You use a nuclear weapon in any form, in any circumstance, and your history. We can certainly do that. We have plenty of nuclear weapons and delivery systems to accomplish that goal. So if this is about deterrence, it seems to me a flat-out statement of our policy: use a nuclear weapon in a tactical mode or any other way, and your history, period. That's deterrence. I think that also happens to be the French view of it. So why do we need to build all these new nuclear weapons? Once you start that process, it seems to me that we head down a road that is not particularly safe in any way, shape, or form. Mr. Mount, would you like to take my remaining 11 minutes and 10 seconds and respond to the arguments on the other side of the table, which would be the right-hand side of the table?
I'd be glad to. I don't want to put words in my colleague's mouth, but as I understand it, the argument for new nuclear capabilities is that a threat to utilize a large nuclear weapon in sort of a limited war scenario would be incredible. And I would dispute that seriously. It's not clear to me that we would ever use a tactical nuclear weapon under any plausible circumstance. As Barry mentioned, delivering a tactical nuclear weapon through a tactical fighter has serious trouble. I don't know that we would authorize it. We couldn't be sure that it would reach its target in the right way. And most importantly, as you mentioned, any use of a nuclear weapon would have enormous diplomatic costs, and it would give any president very serious pause. And the fact that we would incur such massive diplomatic and strategic costs, while plausibly not sort of having any outcome on the military situation on the ground, in turn decreases the credibility of a threat to use one of these weapons. So I would seriously question whether they are needed in specific circumstances.
Mr. Chairman, I'll take another 30 seconds. It just seems to me that we really need to have a continuing and a full debate on this issue, because we will be making decisions in this year and on into the future. In fact, we are doing so today with the long-range strike bomber and the cruise missile that goes presumably with it. That's all part of this process, and it will lead us down a path that we need to understand what the implications of that path are. And the gentlemen here are certainly important in elucidating that path. I thank you for the additional 40 seconds.
I thank the gentleman. Chair, I recognize the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Banks, for 5 minutes.
15 minutes, that'd be perfect.
You like 15,
That's
don't you?
perfect, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thank you for being here. This is a discussion of profound gravity, and I find myself with the persuasion of the gentleman, the first three on my left, simply because I believe it's important to be able to meet a potential enemy with whatever options may be necessary, and they do get a vote in the equation. So, Dr. Bleckman, your recommended strategy makes a basic assumption that U.S. conventional military superiority will continue indefinitely, and I hope you're correct. On the other hand, Mr. Colby's recommended strategy is based on an assumption that U.S. conventional superiority may not continue, and that it's eroding fast in places like maritime Asia, and I think that reports and intelligence that I see seems to be on his side of the ledger, to say the least. If it turns out Mr. Colby is correct, doesn't that make your recommended strategy and posture somewhat invalid?
Yes, sir, you're correct. If the U.S. does not maintain conventional superiority, then we'd have to look at alternative strategies. However, for my sins, I've worked on defense issues in Washington for 51 years now, and I have seen threats inflated at least 3 times over that period. Yes, Russia is making some progress, much less than China, and yes, China is making substantial progress. But if you look at Chinese technological capabilities or the size of their forces, it doesn't compare to what the U.S. already has publicly and what we're building for the future.
Well, perhaps it's a situation at this point where, you know, just the leadership posture is responsible for some of the issues in the Ukraine and Crimea, but it seems to me like they're handling themselves at least strategically pretty wisely. And it seems to me that your recommended cuts in the U.S. nuclear force would be difficult, if not impossible, to reverse in the face of a growing peer threat. And if you're wrong, I think we're imposing a limited response in U.S. nuclear capability. I think it's a dangerous direction to go in. Mr. Murdoch, part of your recommended strategy of structuring accordingly, or deterrence and extended deterrence, you outline both of these, SDF and EDF, and I wanted to draw your attention to your table on page 20 in the last category of massive ordnance penetrator being carried aboard a B-2A and a B-52H. I know that this part of the penetration capability is just simply the velocity and the inertia involved, and given that these two platforms have wildly different airspeeds, can you help me understand that? And I'm hoping to get one more question in quickly here, if it's possible.
Excuse me, sir. The purpose of the chart was to show the relative destructive power of nuclear and conventional warheads, largely on the nuclear side, but I included the largest conventional weapon in there to so that the reader would recognize that the range is very great among nuclear weapons, but there's also quite a significant gap between nuclear weapons and the largest of conventional weapons.
Yeah, it makes
in my mind, they're not substitutable. Politically, they're really not substitutable, but just even in the conventional fragmentation, they're not.
Well, I think that's extremely reasonable. Couldn't agree with you more. Dr. Colby, you mentioned, if I heard it right, that some of the different ways or some of the mid-range where you can incrementally escalate could include things of an EMP nature. And can you help us understand that a little bit better?
Sure, thanks, sir. Well, I think if we're talking about the adversary, EMP can be used in a very destructive way to basically negate or really undermine the U.S. ability to project power through destruction of electronics, space assets, and et cetera. So an EMP scenario is one that we do need to think very seriously about.
Do you have any suggestions?
Well, sir, I think in this kind of context, proportionality. I don't think we should tie ourselves to being precisely proportionate, but having those kinds of responses to be able to demonstrate to a potential adversary that he can't make a move and leave us in a place where we don't have a sensible way to respond is the right.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I think the man makes a very important point. I'm sorry? He makes a very, very important point, and I think it's important that we don't maintain the kind of grid that is so vulnerable that it invites that scenario. So thank you very much.
Thank the gentleman. Chair, I recognize gentleman Mr. Bridenstine for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Every day I'm in Congress, I'm surprised. Most recently, by Mr. Garamendi, my good friend from California, who I have high regard for, who I think is a great thinker, although we might not always agree, if very often at all, I don't know. But his declaratory policy of if you use a nuclear weapon, your history, it's very Reagan-esque, and I'm impressed by that. And I say that very complimentary. What I'd like to discuss are some of the things that we have in common. The ranking member mentioned that the command and control elements seem to be an issue where there's a lot of commonality, which is very important for us because where there's commonality, we can start looking at budgets, at policy, at programs that we can put together. And when you look at the command and control, it seems like everybody's in agreement that we need resiliency, that we need survivability. We have a space-based architecture for command and control that would be survivable and resilient. There's an AOA that's been in the Pentagon now for a long time. We've been trying to get that from the Pentagon. It's been very difficult getting it. But what I wanted to draw on a statement from Mr. Colby. You recommend that the United States develop, quote, more resilient space assets, more terrestrial and air-breathing platforms for C4ISR, and more modular and disaggregated architecture. I think I would agree with all of that assessment. Can you describe specific investments you would support? And do we need a layered architecture to back up the current system?
Well, thank you, Congressman. I think this is actually a really important focus. I think it is one that crosses the aisle because it's vital for the survivability issue, and it's also increasingly in jeopardy because of not just intent on the part of our potential adversaries, but the nature of technological change in the space, counterspace, cyber domain, and so forth. I think disaggregating the architecture is one thing. Making our space capabilities more survivable, but also potential things like air-breathing unmanned aerial systems or airborne platforms that can do relay, so that if your space assets are vulnerable, as they may inevitably be to some degree, to some earnest ASAT attack, then we have other options. We can look at a wide variety of different options. I don't have a particular set of A, B, C, D in terms of recommendations, but actually it's funny you mentioned something I'm thinking about right now, so it's good to hear because I'll redouble in my efforts to think it through.
Well, thank you. Mr. Bleckman, one of the things I'm interested in that you recommended is that the United States develop low-cost space launch capabilities to help with reconstitution. Can you describe how this committee might be helpful in those low-cost? What are the investments that might be necessary to get low-cost space launch capabilities?
Well, I think this is an area where our private sector can make the largest contribution, and we are seeing increasing competition for developing space launch capabilities in the private sector, and this committee can encourage the Air Force and the Department of Defense to open competition for launching satellites. There's been some limitations placed on that in the past, and things are changing a little bit, but they can be encouraged to move more quickly so that these companies have the incentives to invest their own funds and to push their technologies as fast as they can.
So in my last minute, I have a provocative question that might make my colleague from California upset with me.
Will give me 15 seconds.
The Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty is something that Secretary Kerry has been pushing for the Senate to ratify historically. And I think there are very challenging implications if we were to go that direction. And I was wondering if I could hear from Mr. Colby, Dr. Murdoch, and Dr. Payne. I've got 30 seconds remaining, so maybe I can take that for the record. But Dr. Murdoch, would you be willing to take that question? The implications if we go forward with a comprehensive test ban treaty, and instead of testing, we rely on, I guess, computer models.
Well, the computer model that you refer to, the science-based stockpile stewardship program, has actually greatly enhanced our understanding of how nuclear weapons actually function. And while there was a considerable amount of controversy at the outset of that program, there is very little controversy now of that in the scientific community when it comes to our ability to certify whether nuclear weapons will work. There is a question in terms of my bias, my recommendation for developing new capabilities and new weapons with those, that you will be departing from the experiential record of previous nuclear weapons, and that will raise a question again, the issue of do you need to test a weapon in order to be sure that it works? Nuclear weapons have been employed twice. One of them had been tested before, and one of them had not, and they both worked. Now we're in an age of considerably greater sophistication than the first two nuclear weapons, and so I think as we go into the 2025 and beyond, the issue of developing and having confidence in the reliability of nuclear weapons that you develop to deal with new security challenges would make, in my mind, ratifying the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty now unwise.
Gentleman's time's expired. Thank you very much. Dr. Bleckman, you suggest we allow several hundred U.S. tactical nuclear weapons we have, our B-61 nuclear bombs, to simply age out and go away, that we shouldn't modernize them. But it's openly discussed that Russia has many thousands of tactical nuclear weapons, landmines, air defense missiles, artillery shells, and many other types. We eliminated our other forms of tactical nuclear weapons in the 1990s, but Russia didn't follow suit. And now Russia is violating the INF Treaty with ground-launched cruise missiles. So isn't your proposal simply unilateral nuclear disarmament by the United States, something we tried in the 90s and have direct evidence that it didn't work?
Well, let me say first that I do think we need to respond strongly to the Russian violation of the INF Treaty, not by doing anything to violate the START agreement, but I think it is essential that they be held to account to treaties that they're parties to. On the question of eliminating the tactical weapons, I don't believe that the European allies are likely to authorize their crews to be the first ones to deliver a nuclear weapon in the event the Russians use a nuclear weapon in a conflict in Eastern Europe. I think we're going to get ourselves in a terrible political bind in such a situation. Now, I believe we should depend on our strategic forces, our long-range bomber, and I certainly support the new long-range bomber as a very high priority. And we should can deliver the B-61 bomb, which has a variable yield, with the long-range bomber, perhaps base forward in Europe, but not necessarily, and be much more confident that, one, it would penetrate the Russian air defenses, and two, that the political decision would be made in that situation.
Great. You also suggest eliminating 1/3 of our ICBMs and eliminating 2 SSBNs, which means we cannot sustain our continuous at-sea deterrence. With Russia totally uninterested in following such reductions, aren't this dangerous positions?
I don't believe so. I think that we have more than enough weapons to deter a Russian attack on the United States or on any of our allies. I think we can go down to, I don't know what the number is, 1,200, 1,000 weapons and still have more than enough destructive capability that the Russians would be crazy to attack us or our allies. I think deterrence depends lots more on demonstration of political will and leadership and on conventional forces and the knowledge of the adversary that if they take a threatened action, they will confront American military forces and allied military forces on the ground. That's what I think deterrence depends on.
All right. Dr. Payne, the final report of the Perry-Schlesinger Commission on Strategic Posture of the United States stated, quote, working with partners in the intelligence community, the laboratories should be in a position to advise national leadership on foreign nuclear weapons activities bearing on the interest of the United States and its allies. In short, the Commission recommends that the laboratories be allowed to design, simulate, and experimentally assess foreign nuclear weapons designs for the purposes of defense analysis, close quote. Why, in your opinion, is this important? Your microphone, East.
It's important because we need to know what types of capabilities other folks may be developing. And if our labs don't have the ability to try and replicate designs and look at those capabilities, we may not be very familiar with the type of capability that Russia is deploying or China is deploying. And an ignorance at that level could be profoundly dangerous. So I think it's extremely important that our labs be able to have that capability to go look at foreign systems, see how they're designed, understand those foreign systems in every way possible so that we are smart about what our opponents have, not dumb.
Anybody else have any thoughts as to why that's important or not important? Let the record reflect no. I now turn to the ranking member for any final questions he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's a fascinating and terrifying debate, and words like discriminate and proportional sound so good. And they are used in this debate to possibly have a whole new class of weapons that we thought we discarded decades ago. And it certainly gives you an advantage over the others who could then be alleged to favor indiscriminate and disproportional responses. But I wonder, in a nuclear exchange, how good are we at knowing what in fact has happened? Like, could an adversary think a low-yield weapon that we are so proud of because it was discriminate and proportional was in fact a dud? And how do you know? And I know there's seismic detectors and there are lots of ways to kind of tell, but in the panic of war, the fog of war, who really knows? And the world's fate could hang in the balance. So when Dr. Colby advocates switching out D5s for primary-only missiles, or dialing these things down to variable yield, so presumably we get in Mr. Murdoch's sweet spot of between MOPS and 0.3 kiloton. Like, that's, I don't know, how do people know this?
I think as you said, sir, the fog of war does not allow us to promise what you're going to know or not know. The question, though, in my mind is that does that mean that you don't prepare to have the type of options that Clark and Bridge have suggested? Because if you don't prepare to have those types of options, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. All you're going to have are the type of large nuclear options that cause potentially much more damage than anybody would think reasonable under a circumstance. And again, I'm not talking about the employment of nuclear weapons. I'm talking about the importance of having those capabilities to deter the opponent. Churchill said, no matter how mature you are in your sophistication, every now and then you should take the enemy into account. And let me just suggest, if you take the enemy into account in this very discussion, what we know from a number of open Russian sources, I'm not saying anything here that isn't available in the Russian press, is that the Russian military has said they're going in the direction, they have gone in the direction that both Bridge and Clark have talked about, because they see that as a way of getting under the horizon of the U.S. nuclear deterrent. This isn't just us coming up with this stuff. The Russians have said that that is the kind of deterrent they want to have because it beats our deterrent strategy. And so what we're suggesting is we want the capabilities to fill in the blanks, not because we want to use them, but we want to make sure that the Russians know that use is not an option for them, so that deterrence works. That's the argument that you've heard from this left side of the table from your perspective.
Preparation is a very seductive argument, and I, as a Boy Scout and Eagle Scout, I'm all for being prepared. But capability can translate into survival. It can also translate into temptation. You build a series of perfect hammers, then you're going to use that hammer, and every problem will start looking like a nail. And it's interesting how many times Russia has come up in the discussion, because in terms of population, Pakistan is now larger, and it may be a less predictable nuclear power. But we like to demonize, Dr. Bleckman pointed out 3 times in his career, we've exaggerated the capabilities of different enemy categories. It's really important we get this right.
If I,
yes.
Could I comment, Congressman? Because I think it's a very important question. I honestly, I think it's I mean, look, these are horrible weapons that could kill untold numbers of people. I mean, they are the absolute catastrophic weapon, and so they need to be treated with the utmost seriousness. And I certainly don't come here and recommend this lightly, but I think, and I particularly say, I don't think we should be thinking about escalation control or escalation dominance. We are thinking about an inherently risky and potentially catastrophic endeavor. But as Dr. Payne points out, we don't really have a choice. At a grand strategic level, we extend deterrence to countries around the world, over 30 countries, including ones where we are conventionally vulnerable to a nuclear-armed adversary with serious conventional forces that he can use very rapidly and who's evinced the willingness to use them. And so we have to have a way to fight wars and defend these countries in ways that's not suicidal. And with respect, Congressman, I think the problem with that strategy, your declaratory policy, is, first of all, it's not credible. The guy's not going to believe it, and it may even invite a challenge because he really won't believe that we'll follow through on it, and it'll be a way to puncture our credibility. And I'm struck by a famous example that was in Fred Kemp's book on Berlin 1961, where there's actually a debate in the Central Committee of the Communist Party in Moscow about the percentage probability of how whether nuclear war would result if they pushed the ball forward in Berlin. And Mikoyan, the defense minister, was saying it's 10% we shouldn't do it, and Khrushchev says no, it's something more like 5% so we can do it. So people gamble even under the nuclear shadow. And I think that if an adversary can say, hey, I can see a way where yes, I'm going to take risk on, but I'm going to be willing to do it anyway. The Arabs, the Egyptians, and the Syrians invaded Israel in 1973, which they knew was very dangerous potentially, but they did it. And so I think what I say to you, Congressman Cooper, is absolutely we need to be restrained, we need to be serious, we need to be sober about this. But I think that the problem here is not that we're going to invent these and use them. I think the problem here is that we are potentially leaving open gaps in that create vulnerabilities that can actually spur the ambition of people like Vladimir Putin.
Congressman, if I might comment, I think it's exactly right to say that we ought to prepare for this new era of strategic competition. I think that's vital to do so. But I think in shifting the bounds of this competition into the nuclear domain, you legitimize Vladimir Putin's reckless movement of nuclear capabilities and his very reckless risk-taking. I think it's vital that the United States and its allies prepare to counter these hybrid strategies in the domain where they've started. So we prepare robust, layered, conventional responses so that we can combat these strategies with strategies of our own that actually have a plausible chance of stopping this kind of aggression on the ground where it starts. I think we have every interest in maintaining a resolute and unified response to Russian aggression at those levels, and no interest at all in allowing Russia to shift the game to the strategic area where he is more capable, relatively more capable.
Well, we need to make sure we don't mistake nationalist bluster for a serious intent. And when you're leading a nation that is declining in population, has a problem with alcoholism, you have to use extraordinary measures to try to be popular in a country like that. I'm in no way defending Mr. Putin, but it's so important that we get this right. Copycat approach, a monkey see, monkey do approach could well be what they're most interested in. When so often we've been on the short end of asymmetric warfare. It seems to me that the ideal response is not a proportional one, but a hugely worse one, but non-lethal. You know, it's amazing what the capabilities of militaries are and the capabilities of warfighting, not just nuclear. So I hope that we will be able to explore these issues. I appreciate Dr. Murdoch leading this very interesting study and getting the debate going again, because it's been too long since we've had one like this. And it's very important that the members of this committee and the Congress be more versed in these issues. And the final point would be Dr. Bleckman's, we've heard a lot of hawkish comments today, but as the National Journal reminds us today, we're about to pass a defense bill that uses pay-fors that are, quote, almost universally regarded as gimmicky. That's a real sign of national strength. That's a real sign of commitment. And everybody talks tough, but you got to be able to pay the bills. And when we're borrowing so much of this money from China to do this, it has a certain ironic touch. So Dr. Murdoch's entirely right. We can pay for this if we have the will to do it. That's a very small percentage of our defense budget. But we haven't been paying for our defense budget. And it goes without saying what our NATO allies have done to shirk their responsibilities. You know, they enjoy our umbrella, but they don't want to pay the bills either. So we have serious issues in the West of willpower and determination. And I hope that debates like this can not only focus on the technical military aspects, but also the social aspects that are required to have a genuinely strong defense. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chair, now recognize the gentleman from California for our final set of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and once again, thank you for this extraordinarily important discussion and debate which will go on for a long time. My concern here is that the advocates of advancing our nuclear forces basically put us down a path where we would be developing multiple delivery systems and multiple weapons on those systems, all of which would enable us to engage in a limited nuclear war. I think that's exactly where this would go, presumably for the purposes of deterrence. Now, if that's where we want to go, to be able to wage a limited nuclear war, then we'll make those investments. On the other hand, if our goal is deterrence, that is to not have anybody use a nuclear weapon, either in a tactical way or in a strategic way, which is a kind of a, in my mind, a foolish dichotomy. But nonetheless, if that's our goal, then is there another way of achieving it? And I guess I laid out another way of achieving it. You use a weapon, then your history. And that's a deterrence. Are we willing to do it, which Mr. Colby suggested perhaps we would not be? Well, time will tell. Hopefully we will not have to pass time and to find out if there's going to be a moment of truth. But it just seems to me extremely dangerous to accept the path that we will create new delivery and new weapons for the purposes of engaging in a limited nuclear war, which I think the three of you are suggesting we should be prepared to do. On the other hand, there is what seems to have almost been forgotten is that we have made extraordinary progress in limiting nuclear weapons. There's no doubt that we've gone from several tens of thousands to significantly less than that, probably less than 10,000. Yes, Russia does have a lot of tactical nuclear weapons. Is there a possibility that they would use them in Estonia? Now, if NATO decides to invade Russia, that's another matter. Would Russia use it in that case? Oh, I'm sure they would. But then why are we invading Russia? Or why is NATO invading Russia? Or maybe it's China and Russia going at this. I don't know. But it just seems to me that we need to be very, very thoughtful here before we accept the policy that the United States is going to develop a series of tactical nuclear weapons for the purposes of engaging in a limited nuclear war. All right. Is that really what we want to do? And is there such a thing as a limited nuclear war? I think there isn't. Now, it may be that the first nuclear war is limited, but the next one, and the next one, and the next one. There's been a policy for some years now that nuclear weapons are off the table for war. They're on the table for deterrence, for sure. And I think that's good, and I think they ought to be there. Now, what does it take for us to maintain a reasonable deterrence? So I'd like to see this I see it in two different ways. One, advocacy for the ability of the United States to maintain or to create the ability to engage in a limited nuclear war, presumably for deterrence of a limited nuclear war. And the other is the traditional deterrence that we've had for more than 50 years. I am deeply concerned that this nation would lead us and the world down the path that we would develop the capability to engage in a limited nuclear war. I don't want us to go there. I think it is extremely dangerous. So with that, I yield back, and
I thank the gentleman, and I thank the witnesses for being here for a very thought-provoking hearing. It's been very worthwhile. I would remind you that we won't leave the record open for 10 days for members who couldn't be here to get their questions submitted to you, and I would ask you to respond to those in writing in a timely fashion if you could. With that, we are adjourned.